Alright, coming at you live from the crystal ball. This is a brief overview / insight into how I make art for my indie roguelike called Cavern, and after that there will be some devlog stuff too. So the normal process that I go through for anything visually important in the game is pretty consistent. I'll come up with a core concept, sort of the reasoning behind what I'm trying to make. So functionality first. Once I have that core concept, I'm thinking of what could this look like? So I start a couple sketches. I write things down on the side of my sketches to say it needs to be able to do this, driving the design with the functionality. And then after I do a sketch, I'll make judgments about the concept, try to figure out what I could change or improve or what doesn't work. And then once I have a final-ish idea, I'll make a more realistic mock-up in Photoshop. So this is not functional at all. This is purely visual and how I would want it to look when it's done. While I'm making this sort of pure art mock-up, I'm thinking about how I would actually implement it in the game, but I am focusing on visuals. So I do this because I don't want to restrict myself by thinking, oh, that can't be done, that's too hard to code, or those kinds of things. I can kind of shoot myself in the foot sometimes in the art department when I think too practically. So it's important that function drives the design, but it's important to design sort of willy-nilly and then build the function into that design. So that way you have everything you want out of the art, but it still is functional and is informed by function. Once I make that initial mock-up, I can kind of try to cut it up into usable chunks and put it in the game and do some testing. I can move forward with a better idea of how I want the final to be. So here's some examples. Two 2D assets that I did the past 2 weeks are concerning the user interface. So one is the player portrait for picking up and equipping stuff and what you shoot, along with how many gems you have. And then the second is swap handling. So this is like the main mechanic of the game. You can actively choose items around the level and turn them into something else. So the UI for that is the second thing I tackled. For the portrait, it kind of went through that process at a quicker pace. I had this sort of block in that was functional in the game before, but I wanted to add some features. So I did a couple mock-ups in Photoshop and then decided to go for something that was a little bit more organic, overlaid on top. I did this sort of loose sketch just to get some rough shapes in there. And then I went on to make the final. The final is composed of a few layers. So for example, there's a background behind the player image that will be swapped out, and then there's that sort of border that goes over it. And that border is separate and has transparency so that the player can be shown through it. I also separated them out so that I can apply special shaders to certain parts of them. For example, it draws the whole sprite, and then I can choose a level top to bottom of how full it is, and then I just color whatever is above that level a certain fill color. That way, when you're trying to drop an object, the slot that you have it in will sort of deload the object, and you can kind of tell the timing about when you would drop it. These are all just PNGs from Photoshop that are put into the game, so nothing fancy. For the swap handling UI, this was a really big overhaul, so I took a lot of time and care when it came to building out a better solution. Originally, that's where this redesign stemmed from. In the Jam version of the game, I used this menu system where a menu would just pop up. It would move relative to the mouse depending on where you were in the screen so that it wouldn't go off the screen, but it was a little cumbersome to click on an object and then have to move the mouse to then click on the menu. It felt natural for me because I'd been doing it a ton, but I realized kind of destroyed the flow of the experience. The flow. I was thinking of how can I make this sort of quicker? And I use a lot of 3D programs, and Maya uses a lot of dial menus, or what are they called? Radial. Is that what it's called? Pie menu? Yeah. A lot of 3D programs use pie menus or radial menus where you click on something and then a circle full of options comes up and you just have to drag your mouse and let go and that option will be selected. This is kind of a sort of like one motion, like click, flick, release, and all that could be done very seamlessly. So that was what I was trying to design for a finalized version of the swap menu. It came out of that functionality argument of how can we make this quicker for people to use? I'm not going to burn down my apartment. So I started with that base concept radial menu. I did a sketch with some notes. Once I was happy with that sketch concept, I took it into Photoshop to make a mock-up. I ripped apart that mock-up, brought it into the game for some testing, and then I polished up each of the pieces in Photoshop so that the final version in the game is super clean. I also took some time to do some other quality things. For example, the whole menu is sort of color-coded. It's this blue color along with the selection color for objects in the game. This is all driven by code, so I can change the menu to whatever color I want, and I'll probably eventually have like a player option for this. I also got to do some cool shaders for like the additive stuff, and I got to do a shader for the circle on the outside. I wanted this sort of range. If you're in a pinch and it's hard to get to the center of the menu, which also cancels it, you can drag very far out of the menu and it'll cancel it, but it shows you a ring, and that's done with a shader that just draws a big texture and decides a circle radius and then chops off a couple parts via an angle, and you get this dotted line effect. This stuff is user interface, so that's things that sort of lay on top of the game and that players need to see clearly, or at least read clearly when they glance at it. Generally, I'm going for things with more contrast here so that people can see them, and I generally try to keep the shapes simple so they're not too distracting as well. For the 2D art part of it, like the painting, I would suggest focus on light and shadow and break up your image into 2 zones, one for light and one for shadow. It gets you that immediate contrast and that immediate read. Another comment about 2D assets here is just that all the buttons and icons in the game, for objects, they're pre-rendered, meaning I'll 3D model an object, put it into the game, and then I will take a screenshot of it just straight from the game, put it into Photoshop, clean it up, and export it back out. That's the in-game icon for that object. This is loosely considered pre-rendered graphics. And then for some things, like icons above the player's health bar, certain status effects and things like that, those are just hand-drawn in Photoshop. Let's get into some 3D assets. So I made a ton of upgrades, which we'll talk about the actual functions later. But on the art side of things, generally when I 3D model something for this style of game, I'm 3D modeling it extremely simply so that it can run well. And then at least when it comes to the polygonal model, I'm looking at the silhouette. That's sort of the contour or the edges of the object as I'm spinning it around. Does it look round if it's a rounded object? If not, maybe up the resolution, those kinds of things. It's going to look most 3D with a decent shape and good lighting. I have this front lighting in my game because when you go into a cave, you are often wearing a headlamp. Generally, everything you're looking at will be lit directly from where you are looking, and it can give things a very interesting, sort of almost flat look. It also contributes to that sort of pre-rendered graphics kind of deal that I mentioned. Point being, the objects can be pretty simple, and the textures can be very simple, and the lighting will carry it a long way. About the texturing, if you watch any of my other devlogs or seen anything about how I generally texture stuff, I'm using my same process, which is I use one texture sheet for the entire game. I try to pack as many objects into this one like trim sheet so that the game can do less texture lookups. It's really not that crazy of a difference in efficiency, but it makes texturing super easy because I can just throw UVs around wherever I want. I can UV an object from the camera direction in Blender and just slap it on to a texture, or I can rip it apart and throw it all across the sheet and it'll generally be fine. I have different types of sort of materials emerging on my sheet, like wood and metal. Unless it's something specific, I don't have to make a new little trim texture for it. I can just reuse other parts of the texture. A lot of how the object looks in the lighting in the game is also driven by the material. So I just have a simple material with a certain roughness parameter that gives it that specular highlight. And another thing that can take these like really crappy simple models a long way is shaders. So materials that move vertices or expand to add outlines or make things additive or multiplicative, or look like glass and those kinds of things. All of that is just shader stuff going on. A simple effect like a glass or something can carry an extremely simple model a very long way. So here's some stuff I did over the past 2 weeks. I'm working towards getting the game ready for a sort of alpha demo. It will be relatively soon, so if you're interested in that, definitely wishlist the game on Steam or jump in the Discord.
I forgot to record this, but the game is currently at 430 wish lists.
But I've been hammering away at upgrades, so here are all the upgrades. I did a mirror upgrade, a broken mirror. The mirror has a chance to reflect the damage you take in blood damage to whatever dealt it to you. And so blood damage ignores armor, so any armor you have, it will ignore and it'll deal directly to your core health. So it's pretty good, but it's only a chance to be applied. I made a straw hat upgrade, which gives you plus 10 health but explosions are always lethal, even if you have a million armor or a shield or whatever. I'm trying to make upgrades with negative and positive effects. Some of the upgrades are extremely simple, as you'll see. Some of them I try to have interesting use cases for them. Pickpocket. So this upgrade lets you steal from enemies. So this might be good on a character that can equip weapons. If you see a guy with a really crazy sword, you just need to get close enough to him to steal it. The muffler gives you +1 emit whenever you shoot something. So it'll shoot twice. And this works with upgrades like the welder. So every time it emits a spark, that counts as you emitting a spark, and you will emit 2. Pincushion deals 3 physical damage every time you get hit back to the attacker. So this is flat damage, it's physical type damage, but it's consistent. The backup generator gives you a shield, and then also when you get hit and have 1 health left, it gets you a shield as well. So it's kind of a you might die, but the shield will save your life. Walkie Talkie is all emitted projectiles gain homing. The next 3 are just flat damage upgrades. So the spike bracelet gives you +3 physical damage. The battery gives you +2 energy damage, and the matchbox gives you +1 fire damage. And the reason I did this was because I'm trying to balance some of the stuff that I have so far. We'll see what's actually broken when you guys test it. The spectacles are a pair of glasses, and they give you a chance to deal the damage that you just dealt again, but as a different damage type. So it could be blood damage or magic damage or water damage or physical damage or blah 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 blah. That one's pretty cool, I think, and it can proc off itself. So if you get really lucky, you could string it into just killing whatever you hit, like one shot. Guts is +4 health, but a chance to be poisoned on hit. So the poison ticks once, but it does blood damage after a short time. So this is a pretty interesting upgrade. It gets you a lot of health, but you have this negative side effect, which is you might take a blood damage every once in a while, and that could be dangerous. The last upgrade that I got to implement so far is called Fortify. It makes your heals grant armor. So you can heal a certain amount, and you can get extra armor as a result. I want to make a bunch more upgrades, and some of the ideas I have are dealing damage based on how much armor you have, stuff with when you gain or lose a shield, all sorts of fun stuff. But my goal for the demo is to get a nice pool of upgrades, interesting enemies to fight, and then cool dynamics with the swapping mechanic. And a boss. So some quality of life stuff I did was there's now a selector for dropping stuff or placing stuff in the grid, which is super helpful. I added a little sort of 2D image. Pressure plates and landmines now have this pressure graphic. So it shows if there's pressure on this object, it will be flat. And then if there's not pressure on it anymore, it'll be protruding. This is useful for like if you step on a landmine, it doesn't trigger until after you leave the mine. You can switch places with an enemy or something like that, but this is just a better way to sort of visually show that. I'll have sound effects that'll add to that as well, but I think it works pretty decently. The final largest thing that I did on the quality of life side is add an outline that differentiates something as hostile or not to you. If something's hostile to you, it'll have a red outline, and if it's non-hostile to you, it'll have a blue outline. This is so that you can tell the difference between spikes that are generated in the level that will hurt you and spikes that you place, which you can just walk over. So if you're ever like unsure about a spike, you can just hover over it and it'll alert you. This is also something that will be sort of taught in a tutorial section of the game. And lastly, I did some self-automation. So I made some editor scripts in Godot to help me create these upgrades faster. So all of the resources that I need to make when I make an upgrade, those can all be created at the click of a button. And so that just kind of helps automate the process so I can do it faster. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with me. I really appreciate the comments on my last video, the tier list. I now have some great game dev YouTubers to watch, and I'm always happy to stir the pot. Again, sayonara. Okay, we're done. Back to business.
You've been feeling say how to the Cavern. RPGs, say how to the Matchbox.